Rome. January 897 AD. In a basilica near the Tiber River, a dead man is sitting on a throne. He has been dead for 9 months. His name was Formosus, and he was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, until his heart stopped, and they buried him in the crypt of St. Peter's. That should have been the end of him. It was not. Pope Stephen VI has ordered the body exhumed.
The corpse of Formosus has been dressed in full papal vestments, the white alb, the golden cope, the pointed mitre placed on what remains of the skull. He has been propped upright on a throne before an assembled senate of Roman clergy. A defense attorney has been appointed to argue on his behalf. The defense attorney, understandably, says very little. Pope Stephen paces in front of the body. He is screaming.
Contemporary accounts describe him as nearly incoherent with rage, a rage that had been building for years over decisions Formosus made while he lived. Now Stephen intends to prosecute him for those decisions. The fact that Formosus cannot respond is apparently not a problem. The verdict is predetermined. Formosus is found guilty of perjury and of violating canon law. His vestments are torn from the lifeless body.
3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers used to consecrate the Eucharist, to ordain priests, to bless the faithful, are removed. What remains is dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. This event has a name. History calls it the Cadaver Synod. And here is what you need to understand about the papacy would survive Stephen VI. A mob would throw him in prison before the year was out, and a new pope would declare the Cadaver Synod null and void, and fishermen would pull the body of Formosus from the Tiber and return it to St. Peter's. The institution recovered. Barely. But the Cadaver Synod revealed something about Rome in the year 897. It revealed that the papacy was no longer governed by theology, or even by the pretense of theology. It was governed by families,
By grudges, by the kind of raw political appetite that would, within 7 years, produce something that would make the Cadaver Synod look like a procedural disagreement. What was coming had a name. Later historians would call it the Dark Era, the rule of the corrupt.
60 years during which the Bishop of Rome, the man Catholics believed held the keys of Peter, the man who claimed spiritual authority over every Christian soul in the known world, would be appointed, controlled, deposed, and sometimes killed by a single aristocratic Roman family. A family whose most powerful members were not its men, they were its women. This is not a story about the Catholic Church failing its ideals. This is not a story about hypocrisy from a safe distance. This is a story about what happens when sacred office collides with raw human ambition, and nobody with the power to stop it chooses to. This is a story about power, about family, about what an institution can survive when the people running it have stopped believing in anything except themselves. And it begins, as so many disasters do, not with a villain, but with a vacuum. By the late 900s, Rome was a city in freefall.
The great empire that had built her aqueducts and forums and walls was 6 centuries gone. The Carolingian Empire that had briefly held Western Europe together under Charlemagne had fractured after his grandsons divided it among themselves. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of competing dukes, counts, and bishops, each holding whatever land they could defend and owing loyalty to whoever was currently strong enough to demand it.
The city of Rome itself had perhaps 20,000 people, a fraction of its imperial population. Living in the shadows of ruins they no longer had the engineering knowledge to maintain, tending goats in the old forum,
building hovels against the walls of abandoned temples. Into this vacuum came the Theophylacts, and the name of the woman who would take the papacy to its lowest point, lower than the cadaver synod, lower than anything Stephen VI had imagined, was Marozia.
She was the daughter of Theophylact I, Count of Tusculum, military commander of the papal militia, administrator of the papal treasury. She was born around 890 AD. By the time she was 15 years old, she was the secret companion of a pope. By the time she was 40, she had made and destroyed more popes than any emperor in living memory. We will come back to Marozia, but not yet. First, you need to understand the world she was born into.
Theophylact I was not a religious man in any sense that would have satisfied a theologian. He was an administrator, a soldier, a fixer. He held the title Vestararius, a Byzantine-derived word meaning something like the keeper of the imperial wardrobe and treasury, which in Rome in the early 900s meant he controlled the papal finances. He also held the titles of senator and dux and commanded the militia that defended the city.
In practical terms, he was the most powerful man in Rome. The Pope was, at best, a useful partner, at worst, an obstacle. His wife's name was Theodora. Liutprand of Cremona, the bishop and historian who was our primary source for this period, describes Theodora with barely concealed fury. He calls her a shameless opportunist. He says she exercised power over the Roman city, like a man. He means both of these as insults.
What Liutprand reveals, even through his contempt, is that Theodora was genuinely formidable. She managed political alliances. She cultivated relationships with bishops across Italy and with the clergy of Rome. She understood that the papacy was not just a religious office. It was the single most powerful brand in the Western world, and whoever controlled who sat in the chair controlled enormous amounts of land, money, and symbolic authority.
Modern historians are more cautious about Liutprand. Chris Wickham, in his revisionist history of medieval Rome, notes that Liutprand had personal and political reasons to blacken the reputations of the Theophylact women. The scandalous slanders may be exaggerated. What is not disputed is the political reality. The Theophylact family ran Rome, and Theodora was an active participant in that governance, not a passive bystander. She had 2 daughters. The elder was named Theodora, after herself.
The younger, the one history remembers, was named Marozia. Stay with me, because the year 904 is where the Dark Era properly begins, and it begins with conflict. The papacy in the early 900s was not decided by election in any meaningful sense. It was decided by factions. In 897, the year of the Cadaver Synod, Rome had seen 3 popes in a single year. Popes were elected, deposed, imprisoned, eliminated. The office had become a prize that powerful men fought over, the way warlords fight over a fortress. By 903, the situation was this. A mild, scholarly man named Leo V had been elected pope. He had been pope for approximately 2 months when a Roman priest named Christopher staged a coup, imprisoned Leo, and proclaimed himself pope instead. Leo died in prison, possibly murdered. Christopher's papacy lasted barely 6 months. In January of 904, a man named Sergius arrived at the gates of Rome with an armed force behind him. Sergius had been a candidate for the papacy before, twice, and had been passed over both times, which had left him with the specific, focused bitterness of a man who believes he was cheated out of what was rightfully his. He had spent years in exile, waiting. Now he had the support of the Theophylact family behind him, which meant he had the militia of Rome behind him. He took the city. He had Christopher imprisoned. Christopher died. Again, possibly murdered. Pope Leo V
still alive in his own cell, died shortly after. Sergius III was now pope. He would be the first pope of the Dark Era. He would not be the last. Here is what you need to know about Sergius III. He was not stupid, and he was not purely monstrous. He rebuilt the Lateran Basilica after an earthquake had damaged it.
He resolved a long-standing theological controversy about the validity of certain ordinations. He was a real ecclesiastical administrator in ways that some of his successors would not be. He was also, according to Liutprand, in an illicit relationship with a girl named Marozia, who was approximately 15 years old at the time. Liutprand says flatly that Marozia bore a son by Sergius. That son would later become pope. We will come back to him.
Whether or not the relationship was exactly as Liutprand describes it, coercive, exploitative, a middle-aged man of absolute power and a teenager, the political reality is clear enough. Sergius was bound to the Theophylact family by more than alliance. And the Theophylact family, through Theodora, through Theophylact, and now through their young daughter Marozia, had their hands on the office of the Bishop of Rome in a way that no family had ever achieved before.
Here is what most people miss about this moment. The Theophylacts did not storm the papacy from outside. They grew into it from within. Theophylact managed the papal treasury. His family ate at tables with cardinals and bishops. Marozia was not some outsider seducing a pope from beyond the walls. She grew up inside the world of Roman ecclesiastical politics, the way a senator's daughter grows up inside the world of government. The capture of the papacy was not a coup.
It was a slow, patient, generational absorption. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, the Theophylacts were the papacy. Sergius III died in 911. The family moved smoothly to ensure the next pope, and the one after that, were men they could manage. But managing popes was harder than it looked. A capable man, once in the chair, had a way of developing inconvenient opinions about his own authority. In 914, a man named John was elected to the papacy. His name would be John X. He was the Archbishop of Ravenna before his election, which was itself unusual, since Rome generally preferred to elect from its own clergy. His elevation to the papacy is credited in most sources to the influence of Theodora, Marozia's mother, who is said to have been politically and personally close to him. Liutprand, predictably, says they were romantically involved. Modern historians are less certain.
What is certain is that Theodora backed him, the Theophylact network supported him, and John X became pope. What nobody anticipated was that he would be good at it. Before we go any further, because this story is about to get considerably stranger, if you have found this video and you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the time. We cover Christian history the way it actually happened, not sanitized, not simplified, not stripped of the human drama that makes it real.
Hit subscribe. And if you want to understand how this era fits into the larger sweep of papal history, there is a playlist linked in the description that will give you the full picture. Now, John X, the one pope of this era who could actually lead an army. For the better part of a decade in the early 900s, a Muslim military force had occupied a fortified position at the mouth of the Garigliano River, on the border between what is now Lazio and Campania.
They had arrived in 881 and simply stayed, raiding, controlling roads, extracting tribute from villages and monasteries across central Italy. The monastery of Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine house founded by Saint Benedict himself, had been sacked. Travelers on the roads south of Rome were not safe. It was an open wound in the heart of Christian Italy, and no one had been able to close it. John X closed it.
In 915, he did something no pope of his era had done. He personally rode out at the head of a coalition army. He had spent a year building the alliance: Byzantine forces from the south, Lombard princes from the north, local lords and militia from across the peninsula. He brought them together on the banks of the Garigliano River in June of 915 and fought. The Battle of Garigliano was a decisive Christian victory. The encampment was destroyed. The hostages they held were freed.
The roads were open again. Pope John X stood on a battlefield in papal vestments and won a war that had been festering for 30 years. For one bright moment, the papacy was what it was supposed to be. But John X had made a mistake that capable men in captured institutions often make. He had started to believe he was actually in charge. By the mid-920s, his relationship with the Theophylact network had curdled. Theodora was dead or dying.
The family's power had passed almost entirely to Marozia, now in her 30s, now married to a military nobleman named Alberic of Spoleto, now holding the title Senatrix of Rome. Senatrix, a title no woman had held in Rome's history, not in imperial times, not in the centuries since. Marozia gave it to herself, or had it given to her, and the fact that no one in Rome found the authority to object tells you everything about her position. John X had allied himself with her enemies.
He had given power and influence to his own brother, Peter, which threatened the Theophylact family's dominance of the city's finances and militia. He had, in short, stopped being useful and started being difficult. Pay attention to this, because what happened next would be repeated, with variations, across the entire 60-year span of the Dark Era. In 928, Marozia moved. Her forces entered the Lateran Palace, the seat of papal government, while John X was holding court.
Her men killed his brother Peter in front of him. John himself was seized, stripped of his papal insignia, and imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, the great fortress on the Tiber that had once been the Emperor Hadrian's tomb and had since become Rome's most convenient dungeon. He was deposed. A new pope, Leo VI, was installed in his place. 3 months later, John X was dead in his cell. The sources disagree on the method. Some say he was silenced permanently.
Some say he was starved. Liutprand implies something more deliberately violent. What is not disputed is that Marozia had him removed from the chessboard with the clean efficiency of someone who had been planning the move for a long time. Leo VI lasted 7 months. His successor, Stephen VII, lasted 2 years. Both were Marozia's men, figures installed to hold the chair while she consolidated what she really wanted. What she really wanted was the papacy in her own family, not merely under her influence, in her blood. Here is the part nobody tells you about Marozia. She was not simply power-hungry in a generic sense. She was strategically brilliant in a way that her male contemporaries consistently failed to anticipate, partly because they could not quite believe a woman was capable of the moves she was making. She had positioned herself as senatrix, as patrician, as the dominant secular authority in Rome. She controlled the militia and the city's finances through her alliances. She had removed a pope. She had installed 2 more. And now, in 931, she played her final card. She had a son. His name, the sources tell us, was John. He was around 20 years old. He was the son of her first husband, Alberic of Spoleto. At least that is the official account. Liutprand says he was actually the son of Pope Sergius III, conceived when Marozia was 15, raised in the knowledge of his true parentage. We cannot verify this with certainty across 11 centuries. What we can say is that in 931, Marozia had him elected to the papacy. Her son became Pope John XI. Think about what this means.
A woman who had been the secret partner of one pope now had her own son sitting on the throne of Peter.
She had, depending on which account you believe, completed a 30-year project of placing her own blood on the most powerful chair in Western Christendom. She moved into the Lateran Palace. She managed his correspondence. She received ambassadors on his behalf. By any practical measure, she was governing the church. And then she overreached. Marozia's first husband, Alberic of Spoleto, was dead. She had recently married again, a nobleman named Guido of Tuscany. Guido was now also dead.
And in 932, she married for a third time. Her third husband was Hugh of Arles, the king of Italy. This was, on paper, the crown of her career, a marriage that would make her queen of Italy and give her a legitimate secular throne to match her ecclesiastical dominance. She had not accounted for her son from her first marriage. His name was Alberic. He was not the pope.
He was the son of Marozia and Alberic of Spoleto, which made him the half-brother of Pope John XI, the stepson of the new king of Italy, and, on the day of the wedding feast between his mother and Hugh of Arles, apparently the recipient of a public humiliation. The sources say Hugh struck him or insulted him in front of the assembled guests. The exact nature of the offense varies by account. What happened next does not.
Alberic II went into the streets of Rome and called for a revolt. Rome had been angry for a long time. The Theophylact family's dominance of the city was efficient as dominations go. The roads were maintained, the militia kept order. The finances of the papacy flowed through channels the family controlled, which meant the family was rich and the city was at minimum functional. But there is a particular kind of resentment that builds in people who are governed well by people they did not choose, a resentment born not of suffering, but of humiliation. The Romans had tolerated Theodora. They had tolerated Theophylact. They had watched Marozia depose a pope and install her own son, and not quite found the moment to object. But the spectacle of Marozia marrying a foreign king and bringing that king into the Lateran Palace to rule over Rome, that was a step too far.
Alberic's call for revolt found an audience. Within hours of the wedding feast, a crowd had gathered. By the end of the day, Marozia and Hugh of Arles were besieged inside Castel Sant'Angelo, the same fortress where Marozia had imprisoned Pope John X 14 years earlier. Hugh of Arles fled Rome. He would not return. Marozia was captured. Her son, Alberic II, imprisoned his own mother in Castel Sant'Angelo. He kept her there for the rest of her life. She never left.
Marozia, who had installed popes and removed a pope and married a king and signed her name as Senatrix of Rome, spent her final years in a tower on the Tiber, watching the city she had dominated pass into her son's hands. We do not know when she died. The sources simply stop mentioning her. She disappears from history as thoroughly as she had once dominated it. A woman too dangerous to execute and too dangerous to release, so she was simply forgotten. She was, at most, in her mid-40s.
Alberic II ruled Rome for 22 years, from 932 to 954, and he ruled it with a thoroughness his mother would have recognized. He held the title Prince and Senator of all the Romans, which he gave himself, and he ran the city with the efficiency of a man who had grown up watching how power was actually exercised rather than how it was supposed to be. He controlled the secular administration completely. He kept the popes weak and quiet, and spiritually functional, but politically irrelevant. The pope during the middle years of Alberic's reign, Agaputus II, was by all accounts a decent and competent ecclesiastic. He held synods, managed the church's affairs, corresponded with bishops across Europe. He was also, in every practical sense, Alberic's employee. But there is a strange thing about Alberic II. He was better. Not good in any absolute sense. He held his mother captive for life. He used the church as an instrument of political control. He accumulated power with the same appetite as the Theophylacts before him. But he was better in this specific way. He does not appear to have used the papacy for personal enrichment in the grossest sense. He allowed competent men to hold the office. He did not murder popes. Under his rule, the papacy stabilized into something that at least resembled an institution, rather than a battleground.
Eamon Duffy, in Saints and Sinners, notes that Alberic's 22 years were paradoxically among the more orderly the papacy had seen since before the Cadaver Synod. Order, though, has a way of ending. In 954, Alberic II was dying. He was in his early 40s. The Theophylact line did not tend toward longevity. He called the Roman nobility and the Roman clergy to his bedside.
And there, in what must have been one of the more remarkable deathbed scenes in medieval history, he extracted from them an oath. They would elect his son as the next pope. His son's name was Octavian. He was around 18 years old. Let that settle for a moment. Alberic II, the man who had overthrown his own mother to end the dominance of her faction, spent his last breath recreating exactly what she had built. His mother had installed her son as pope. He would install his son as pope. The pattern that had begun with Marozia and Sergius III, the pattern of family blood on the throne of Peter, was about to reach its logical conclusion. 1 year later, in 955, Pope Agapetus II died. The Roman nobility and clergy, bound by their oath, gathered and elected Octavian to the papacy. He was 18 or 19 years old. He took the name John XII, becoming only the second pope in history to take a name different from his baptismal name. He was simultaneously, by inheritance from his father, the prince and senator of Rome. No man before him and no man after him would hold at the same time both supreme spiritual authority and supreme secular authority over the city of Rome. Octavian was pope and prince. He was 18 years old.
And the men around him were about to discover that they had perhaps not thought this through. We are about to enter the final chapter of the Dark Era, the 60-year reign of the Theophylact family over the chair of Peter. And I want to tell you honestly, it gets worse before it gets better. John XII is the pope about whom Liutprand of Cremona wrote the most colorful accusations. He is the pope who forced the intervention of an emperor.
He is the pope whose deposition in 963 would echo the Cadaver Synod from 60 years before, history rhyming in the way only real history does. If you have been watching this far, leave a comment below and tell me, did you know this period existed? Most people who grew up in Christian traditions never learned that the papacy passed through this. If this video is opening something up for you, subscribe, share it, and stay with me for the end.
Because the end of this Roman crisis is not simply a story of scandal. It is a story about how institutions survive what should destroy them, and that part matters. Liutprand of Cremona has opinions about John XII. He has many opinions. He expresses them at length, with evident relish, and with the specific energy of a man who was personally acquainted with some of the people he is slandering. You should know, before we proceed, that Liutprand is not an unbiased source. He was a skilled political operator who used scandal as a weapon, and he had reasons, personal and political, to make the Theophylact line look as bad as possible. Modern historians read him the way you read a brilliant, vindictive eyewitness, with interest, with caution, and with the understanding that even his exaggerations tend to point towards some real underlying truth.
With that caveat clearly on the table, here is what Liutprand says about John XII. He says the Pope held scandalous feasts in the Lateran Palace. He says he turned the palace into a house of vice and the pilgrim's hospice into his private playground. He says he blinded his confessor, severely injured a subdeacon, and ordained a deacon in a horse stable on a whim. He says John drank toasts to the devil. He says he invoked Jupiter and Venus during dice games. He says that when women came on pilgrimage to pray at the tomb of St. Peter, their safety in the neighborhood of the Lateran could not be guaranteed. Some of this is almost certainly exaggerated. Some of it may be fabricated entirely. But here is the thing about John XII. Even the sources that are not Liutprand suggest that he was genuinely problematic.
Even the Liber Pontificalis, the official record of papal history, not exactly a document disposed toward embarrassing the papacy, is notably thin and evasive about John XII's spiritual achievements, because there weren't many. He was a teenager given absolute power who had never been formed by anything except politics, and he governed accordingly. He also made a catastrophic political error. The Italian peninsula in the mid-900s was contested territory. A powerful German king named Otto I, whom history would call Otto the Great, had been consolidating power north of the Alps and beginning to push his authority southward into Italy. John XII initially allied with Otto because John needed military protection from a rival Italian lord who was threatening his secular territories. He invited Otto into Italy. In 962, Otto came. John crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica on the 2nd of February, the first coronation of a Holy Roman Emperor since Charlemagne's line had faded. It was the last independent act of the Dark Era. Otto I had not come all the way to Rome to be a figurehead. He was the kind of man who, when he entered a city, immediately began counting its defenses. He looked at the papacy the Theophlact family had produced, a teenager pope surrounded by scandal, governing an institution that had lurched from crisis to crisis for 60 years, and he made a decision. He left Rome. He let John XII continue, but he watched. And John, apparently not grasping the situation he was in, began intriguing against Otto almost immediately after the coronation. He sent envoys to Otto's enemies. He made alliances with the lords who were Otto's rivals.
He was 18 and 19 and 20, and he apparently believed that the city of Rome and the prestige of the papacy were still enough to protect him from a man who had just unified the Germanic kingdoms and led armies across the Alps. They were not. In the autumn of 963, Otto I returned to Rome. He convened a synod.
Not a Vatican council, not an internal church proceeding, a synod run by the power of an emperor, attended by bishops under imperial pressure, designed to do one specific thing: put the Pope on trial. Now watch what happens next. The synod opened in November of 963 in the Lateran Basilica. A list of charges was read. The charges included infidelity, gross immorality, simony, ordaining clergy for money, and, most damning in Otto's eyes, treasonous alliance with the enemies of the empire. John XII was summoned to appear before the synod and answer the charges. 3 times the summons was sent. 3 times John refused. He fled Rome and took refuge in the hills. The synod, meeting in his absence, voted to depose him. Do you see it? Do you see what is happening? 66 years before this synod, Pope Stephen VI had convened the Cadaver Synod, had put a dead man in a chair, and prosecuted him for crimes against the Church. The charges were theater. The verdict was predetermined. The point was the destruction of a man's legacy, and the legitimization of a power grab. And now, in 963, Otto I had convened a synod, summoned a pope 3 times, received no answer, and voted to depose him in absentia. The charges were real this time, but the structure, the powerful man using the machinery of ecclesiastical law to destroy the man in the chair, was identical. History had rhymed.
John XII returned to Rome after Otto left. He deposed the pope Otto had installed in his place. He severely injured the clergy who had voted against him, grievously disfiguring one cardinal and permanently injuring another. He held Rome for a few more months, a young man with diminishing control of everything around him, burning the furniture to keep warm. He died in May of 964. He was 27 years old. The sources disagree on the manner of his death.
Liutprand, with characteristic restraint, says he was struck dead mid-scandal by either the devil or a wronged husband. More sober accounts suggest a stroke. He died suddenly, young, having governed the most powerful religious office in the world for 9 years, without, by any account, achieving very much at all. He was the last pope of the Dark Era. The family that had placed him there, the family of Theophylact and Theodora, of Marozia and Alberic, was exhausted. Its men were dead. Its women were imprisoned or forgotten. The Theophylact line would continue in Roman politics for another generation, but the specific grip on the papacy, the 60-year project of making the chair of Peter of family inheritance, was over. Otto I and the reformers he empowered would spend the next decades rebuilding the papal office into something that could, once again, make a credible claim to spiritual authority. It would not be easy. It would not be quick. There would be more corrupt popes, more political machinations, more emperors and anti-popes and schisms. The 11th century would see the Great Gregorian Reform, and the 12th would see Crusades, and the 14th would see the papacy exiled to Avignon for 70 years. The Church is not a story of linear progress. It never was. But the Dark Era, the specific, concentrated horror of those 60 years, the family that made popes the way other families make wine, was done. Here is what I want to leave you with. On a Sunday morning in the year 940, deep in the middle of this era, with Alberic II holding Rome in his fist, and the papacy quietly hollowed out, ordinary Christians woke up and walked to Mass. In the Trastevere district, in the neighborhoods of the Aventine Hill, in the shadow of the great basilicas that the Theophylact family had not managed to destroy, because you cannot actually destroy a building by being corrupt near it, people brought their children for baptism. They buried their parents with the last rites. They confessed their sins to priests who were themselves imperfect, powerless, working in an institution whose leadership was, at that precise moment, a political pawn. They did these things because the faith was never really about the men in the chairs. This is not a uniquely religious observation. You have felt it if you have ever worked for an institution you believed in that was being run by people who didn't deserve to run it. A hospital, a school, a non-profit, a church. You have felt the specific grief of watching something sacred to you be managed by people treating it as a commodity. You have wondered whether the thing itself, the mission, the calling, the actual work, can survive what is being done to its leadership. You have wondered whether the institution deserves your loyalty when the institution's leaders have demonstrated they feel no loyalty to what the institution is supposed to be. The ordinary Romans of the 10th century could not have explained ecclesiology, but they knew, in the way ordinary people always know, that what mattered was not the Pope. What mattered was the Mass,
the bread, the cup, the words spoken over the dead, the water poured over the infant, the priest standing between them, and the silence at the edge of everything they could not control. The dark era ended. The faith that had been draped over like a stain continued. 3 takeaways. The first is about power. This era of corruption was not an accident, and it was not an anomaly.
It was the predictable outcome of mixing sacred office with unaccountable earthly power and removing any check on who held that office. Every institution, religious, civic, corporate, that has ever been captured by a family, a faction, or an interest group has followed the same pattern the Theophylax followed: gradual infiltration, patient consolidation, and then a final move that takes the prize. This period is a case study in how institutions are captured. It is worth knowing. The second is about judgment, specifically about how we judge the past. Liutprand of Cremona was not wrong that something had gone badly wrong in the papacy, but he also used scandalous rumors to make his case in a way that obscured the real issue, which was not who was sleeping with whom, but who held power and how they used it. The label given to this era by later historians focuses attention on the women and their morality rather than on the structural failure of ecclesiastical governance.
Marozia was not a force of nature who corrupted a pure institution. She was a product of a system that had already been corrupted long before she was born. The names we call things matter. They shape what we see and what we miss. The third, and this is the one I want you to sit with, is about endurance. The papacy that emerged from the Roman crisis was not the same institution that entered it. The reformers of the 11th century, men like Pope Leo IX, Cardinal Humbert, and later Gregory VII, looked at what the Theophylax had done and built new structures specifically designed to prevent it from happening again. Celibacy requirements tightened. The process of papal election was formalized, eventually creating the College of Cardinals. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was prosecuted with new seriousness. The reforms were incomplete.
The church remained human and therefore fallible. But the specific mechanisms that had allowed one family to own the papacy for 60 years were dismantled, one, by people who had studied the failure carefully and refused to let it stand. Something broken, if people refuse to accept the breakage, can be remade. Which leads me to the question I want to ask you, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. When you look at institutions today, the ones you care about, the ones you believe were built for good reasons, what do you think it takes for ordinary people to hold them accountable? Not wait for an Otto I to ride in and force a synod, but from the inside. What does that look like? Tell me below. The Dark Era lasted 60 years. From the murder of Leo V in 904 to the death of John XII in 964. 2 generations. A grandmother, a mother, a son, a grandson. 4 people from one family, and the popes they placed on the throne, and the ordinary Romans who went to Mass on Sunday mornings and carried the faith forward through all of it. Not because the institution deserved their faithfulness, but because the thing the institution was supposed to point toward was larger than any of the people pointing at it.
That is not a small thing to know.